you looking for a different level of truth about your challenges and struggles? Then be a part of the Yes and podcast, hosted by empowerment strategist and trauma specialist Jennifer Whitacre. Every Wednesday, we challenge conventional thinking on topics like trauma, healing, and so much more. Learn life lessons and great nuggets of wisdom from guests who've moved through their pain and suffering to discover a new purpose in life. Now, here's your host, Jennifer Whitacre.
Hi, everyone. This is Jennifer Whitacre, and we're here today for another episode of Yes and. And today's guest on Yes and is Jay Allen. Jay is a combat veteran whose life got turned upside down in 2001, resulting in a medical discharge from the armed forces. Rather than letting this be a reason to give up, Jay used it as a sign to get up. And since then, Jay has gone on to win global awards and inspire all who meet him. And he's here today to have a conversation with us about PTSD. Jay is a veteran in the UK military forces, and I just want to emphasize that because I'm here in the United States, so I just want to let all of our listeners know that you're coming from the UK, not from the US. And at the same time, PTSD knows no country boundaries. So it doesn't matter what country you're from, where you are on the planet, there is potential if something tragic happens in your life that PTSD could manifest. So Jay, it's an honor to have you with us today. Welcome to the show, and thank you for being here.
Jennifer, thanks very much for having me.
Yes, thank you. Now, I noticed that you said that you had some incidents that happened that caused you to get a medical discharge from your military service. Are you willing to open up and tell us a little bit about what those incidents were?
Sure. I think it's perhaps best if I just quickly share a little bit of context with regards to how I ended up in the military and how I ended up in the position that I was in, which resulted in the injuries, if that's all right.
Perfect. Yeah, backstory is wonderful.
Sure.
Absolutely.
So I was very fortunate that I was born into quite an affluent family. I have two professional working parents. My mum worked in public sector within the government. My father ran his own business. I'm the eldest of four. I was brought up predominantly by my nan, who acted as a living nanny for the house. And from the outside, everything looked particularly rosy. Everything looked good. It was a privileged lifestyle to live in. Not everything on the outside is as it seems. And
I think you've already hooked a lot of our listeners.
It was very clear from a very early age that my parents had already mapped out the rest of my life. They determined which school I was going to, which teachers would teach me, which subjects I would take, which sport activities I would take part in. I think I was about 7 when I was first told that when I grow up, I'm going to be a doctor. The family needs a doctor in the family, and you're going to be the doctor. And the whole of my life was pretty much mapped out ahead of me by two parents that meant well, but hadn't given any considerations to my perception of this and what I wanted to achieve. So for me, joining the army was a significant choice. I'd already gone to college, into university, and qualified. I originally qualified as a social worker with the aims to try and help other kids that have got some psychological problems in the background, maybe. So I was just coming to the end of my college career, my university career, when the army arrived in town and were looking for new recruits. They turned up at the university and they said, we're looking for the top 10%, for which, if you was to give a minimum of 5 years service, we're looking to be able to offset the cost of some of your education. And I made a very conscious decision to give myself to the army for 5 years, if nothing else, so I couldn't be connected or contacted or influenced by my parents. And although I chose to give my service to my country and to a uniform that determines that they govern every part of your life, it was my own personal choice to do so. as opposed to having been born into an environment where it was naturally expected.
Right. And I really think that even just that little backstory, thank you so much for sharing that. I think that's going to hook a lot of our listeners, because there's so many of us out there who grew up in similar circumstances with our parents telling us what we need to do, how we need to grow up, what type of, maybe not, I don't remember my dad telling me what job I had to have, but there was definitely a category of job that was more acceptable than others.
Certainly.
Yeah.
And like I say, I mean, I know that they did it with the best intent. I know there was no malice to what they were doing. They just
Right.
didn't realise the significant impact it was having by failing to give me a choice.
Exactly. And so that need to push on to our children, it's that living vicariously through our kids. I couldn't accomplish this for myself, so I'm going to tell you what you have to do in life. And that creates a lot of suffering within the child. And I specialize in developmental and intergenerational trauma.
Okay.
So what you're talking about are the seeds of, like developmental trauma. Those are the seeds that we carry throughout our life, and everybody compensates differently. My compensation, your compensation to distance yourself from your family, you've already said, was to join the military where they couldn't reach you. My compensation was when I got divorced, which was 21 years ago at this point. I kept my ex-husband's last name to distance myself from my family.
Sure.
So again, just to and I want to point out these examples to give our listeners little seeds to start thinking about how did they compensate, because the compensation.
It's so important to be able to share that, because it gives context to everything that I'm yet to share with you with regards to what happened afterwards.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And we all compensate a little bit differently, but we have to look at our motivations for why we compensate, because that compensation can look wonderful from the outside looking in, but from the inside looking out, there's a lot of pain and suffering behind the decision. So, yeah, I know I interrupted your story, but those little things are so important to point out. So thank you so much for sharing, and please continue.
My pleasure. So I met and I'll be very cautious with regards to this terminology, but I met my first wife just before I joined the army in my last year of university. And when I joined the army, it was a joint decision. It was very much collective that we agreed that it was the best thing for me to do. But it was very quickly evident that I was going to go and live in a foreign country with a new bunch of people on my own, unless we were married. They don't recognize girlfriends and boyfriends and all that type of stuff. You're either single or you're married.
Yes.
So we married after 10 months in order for us to be able to go together as a couple. But I guess in reflection, both of us knew at the time that was very quick and hasty, and perhaps hadn't been fully thought through for all the right reasons. Other than the fact that both of us, for our own separate reasons, were looking to be able to move away from parents and influence, and the thought of living in a different country under a regime that we'd chosen to live under determined that it was a far greater opportunity than it was a risk to either of us and our futures. But we made this decision that I was going to join the army. I went to go and live in Germany. And the plan was, as a private soldier, I joined as the lowest rank possible, joined as a private soldier, and the plan was volunteer for everything. It doesn't matter whether you're good at it or bad at it. It doesn't matter whether you like it or not. Simply volunteer for everything. Get as much experience as you possibly can. Get noticed and get promoted quickly. The idea was, once I'd been promoted at least twice and I was a full corporal, then stop volunteering for all the things that you either don't like or aren't very good at, but continues to volunteer for all the things that you like and are good at, and continues to get promoted, but maybe not quite as quickly as that do all be all. And then we can settle down and start a family. And it was all planned, it was all considered, and this, that, and the other. What we hadn't given consideration for is my first operational tour was the first Gulf War in '91. And 7 months away from wife and family and life and normality, you come back, and within about 3 weeks, 3-4 weeks of being home, Lisa announced that she was pregnant and that we were going to have a child. And all of a sudden, this idea of volunteer suddenly went into, going to become a dad.
Mm-hmm.
And then I guess the first wave of shock and fear went through me with regards to reflecting as someone who had no longer got the best and closest relationships with his own parents, with regards to what sort of a parent will that make you become.
Mm-hmm.
All of these internal dialogues that we go through with regards to, I remember when my parents did this, and I'm going to do that with my kids every day. And I remember when my parents showed me this, and I'm going to show my kids.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the things that went through my mind were with regards to, a lot of the things that my parents did, they did for their own reasons and without my consideration, or without me being considered, as opposed to them considering me. And therefore, what does that mean for me as a parent? What does it mean? What do I need to be and do and have and behave in order that my son or daughter doesn't grow up in the same way that I felt about my own parents? So all of that's going on in the background. In the meantime, I know full well that with an extra mouth to feed and my wife no longer working full-time but part-time, that there was a more significant need for me to be able to be promoted even quicker and earn more money to be able to provide for a family. And therefore, in my head, that meant volunteering for everything and simply trying to get seen by the right people at the right time at the right place. Which, long story short, determined that my wife was almost a single parent family because I was never at home. I was always off doing something because I'd volunteered. And it only took about 3.5 years after my son was born, or our son was born, for those cracks to become too big to resolve. And Lisa took my son back to the UK and said, I can't live in a foreign country on my own without the support of a husband because you're never here. I just need some normality. I'm going home. And she left just before my son turned 4. And I think that was another pivotal point, perhaps another nail in the coffin of what was yet to come, because the plan or the perception with regards to what we'd agreed to do and the big goal and the big aspirations for the future that I was desperately working to try and achieve weren't providing the results that we'd previously thought that they would result in. I was going from being a successful soldier to being an exceptionally unsuccessful husband and father. And that hadn't been part of the plan. And I really struggled to compute with any of that. And when Lisa moved from Germany back to the UK and back towards her parents and normality, I literally threw myself back into my job and said, well, yes, this has been the cause of it, but this is also going to be the only saviour to me. This is the only thing I know and recognise that I'm doing well at the moment. I've just got to get my head down and get it done, and continue to do well, to believe that I'm not a complete failure. So when the second Gulf came, I'd done Bosnia and Kosovo and East Timor and Sierra Leone, and I'd been all over the place on operational commitments. But when the second Gulf came back and the chance to go and finish the job that we never finished in the first place, I volunteered to go as opposed to waited to be conscripted, because as far as I was concerned, one, that was my job. I was a combat medic, and that meant that I needed to be in combat to be a medic. And a lot of my colleagues and friends were going, the people that I now relied on and trusted so much because they were my family when I wasn't with my wife and son, that when I knew that they were being called up, I simply said, well, I'm coming with you, make one more space on the plane, I'm on it. And that was the backdrop really to what happened when I got out there. We'd only been out about 9 or 10 weeks. I was a parachute medic. I was a medic to support the parachute regiment. And we were doing a operational jump. It was just over 9 weeks, not quite 10 weeks into the tour. And there was 2 aeroplanes responsible for dropping about 90, nearly 100 parachutists into a certain area just outside Baghdad in order to be able to prepare for part of the ridding of Saddam Hussein and the freeing of the Iraqi people. And I already knew, I'd done several jumps before. I was quite confident and competent in what was happening. And I already knew that I could never step the first off the foot plate. I was always good at following people and enjoying the little bit of free fall and then the excitement and the adrenaline and the rush. The odd occasion where I was ever the first on the foot plate, I always got cold feet. I always struggled to be able to make that first step. So I made sure that I was well inside the pack. I was number 17 in pack orders to be able to jump. And as far as everybody else concerned that day, that was another operational jump. It was another day at work, and everything was going to go well. The one thing that we're always taught as part of parachute training is before you step off the back plate, clear your head, clear your mind. The next 3, 4, 5 seconds are critical, that you are crystal clear on the drills that you've done 100,000 times in practice. And I didn't do that. I stepped off the foot plate, following everybody else, knowing full well that this about 48, 50 hours after that jump, I was already booked to be on a flight out of the Gulf to come back to the UK to be a pallbearer for one of my best friend who'd subsequently been killed a week beforehand in a improvised explosive device. And his parents had made a specific request that I was going to be a pallbearer at his funeral. I was the godfather to his son, and I knew that I'd got 48 hours left of operational commitment left before I was due to fly home and be at Calvin's funeral. And as I stepped off the foot plate, following everybody else, rather than clearing my head and thinking the drills, I was actually writing his eulogy. I was actually in my head just going through the script of what I would need to say to his parents and his son and his wife a few days later at his funeral. And an accident occurred. Every now and again, a parachute doesn't fully open. Every now and again, probably 1 in 10,000 or so, just a little bit of canvas gets snagged on the way as it opens, and it creates what we call in the trade as a little tear. It's not, it's just a simple little flap on the parachute that hasn't fully opened. But if you don't do anything about it, it starts to force you into a spiral.
Okay.
And then the more you spiral, the quicker it becomes. And once you get to about 30, 35 degrees, the parachute implodes and you fall into it and plummet.
Okay.
So there is the necessity to try and clear it and fix the problem. And you're always taught what to do and how to do and when to do. But you only do that as a drill if you're already thinking about some of the things that will happen. And I wasn't. So when this tear happened and I looked up and I saw it, rather than going straight into automatic resolve mode, I simply said, okay, so today's the day that I'm joining Calvin. It's going to be a double funeral. And I just sat and waited for the spiral. I froze. I didn't know. There was no intent to kill myself. For me, there was just this intervention that says, well, everything else other than your work life is gone to rat at the moment. Maybe this is a sign. And I paused and froze. Now, the simple fact is, when you jump operationally, you jump as low as possible because whenever you're in the air, you're a sitting duck. So you've not got many seconds to try and resolve this before the inevitable anyway. And as I was plummeting past everybody else, and they're busy yelling at me, "Pull your reserve!" I suddenly go, "Oh yeah, there's a reserve," and I click back into the here and now. But by the time you've rid your main chute and you've pulled a reserve, when you've jumped at such a low altitude and you've already paused for too many seconds, it didn't give sufficient time for the reserve to open before there wasn't enough air left. And I landed at about 34, 35 miles an hour.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I bounced about 22, 23 feet in the air, and then landed again. I think it was probably only the fact that we landed in sand that I'm here today. But I broke my back, I broke my hip, I completely shattered my femur. My left leg was pretty much jelly. I was in a mess.
Okay. Well, there's a lot going on in that story.
Sure.
Yeah, there's a lot happening. Because I noticed, like, even at the very beginning, when you were talking about your son, you were talking about being worried about what type of parent you were going to be. And again, being raised um, in a household, just pointing out some of the developmental issues, being raised in a household when your parents are more concerned about what they want for you than about your feelings and what you want for yourself. There is that worry, especially if you're aware of it and you have an amazing level of awareness inside of yourself to notice these things. Because a lot of people, this isn't even on their awareness. They don't even think about stuff like this on a regular basis. So to worry about, oh my gosh, what type of parent am I going to be? Am I going to do, like there are things that were wonderful for me. I want to do that with my kid. Other things that I don't want to do, that I don't want to screw up. Again, that's kind of normal thinking. And at the same time, that level of worry and self-doubt can go off the rails for somebody, who is struggling with developmental trauma. And developmental trauma is different than combat PTSD, because developmental trauma is that little day in and day out and day in and day out. It's what creates your sense of normal, what you're used to, what you have the capacity to deal with in your life. And that's different for everybody. So I see some of these developmental issues, kind of like bubbling to the surface, and then the thought process, and again, this is a beautiful example of how institutionalized policies don't always, if we follow them to the letter, it can be detrimental to what's happening in our real life.
Sure.
So putting you on, you said that you had 48 hours left of, combat duty, or I can't remember the terms that you used, but you had 48 hours left that you were committed to do. And any logical, reasonable person, now I'm not saying that, the military institution is a logical, reasonable person, because it isn't, but having these rules and these guidelines, knowing the stages of grief and knowing the shock of, losing somebody that was a close friend, the way in which they were lost, you're in grief. And so yeah, any logical person would know that your head is not fully going to be in the game. And in my humble opinion, as a trauma specialist, it's a little bit irresponsible to have you jumping out of a plane and going through your normal duties in that state of mind. Because there's this physiological response, and you even acknowledge that your body went into freeze. Freeze is a subconscious response. It's not something that you have conscious control over whenever freeze sets in the body. It's a part of our sympathetic nervous system. So there's a lot of stuff going on here, and thank you for being so detailed in talking about this. And so yeah, tell us a little bit more. Like, you left off that you were broken in a lot of places. Kind of like Humpty Dumpty hit the ground.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
And so oh my gosh,
what I hadn't computed at the time was the strength of human adrenaline and the survival fight for survival natural instinct that we have within us.
Yes.
Because even though I was in excruciating amounts of pain, I knew that I'd jumped into what we call a hot zone. I knew that there was the risk of incoming fire, and very quickly after I landed, we started to receive incoming fire. I knew full well that if I didn't do some things to try and protect myself, I was likely that the injuries I'd suffered were only the start of the story. Now, every soldier carries morphine. It's always in your top right-hand pocket. I was able to remove my morphine and give myself 2 morphine autojet shots, enough to be able to try and overcome the pain and trying to understand a little bit about my surroundings and the impact, and trying to come up with a game plan for at least the next 3 or 4 minutes until everybody else was around and able to help. And very quickly, at the moment that I'd landed and I hadn't cleared my chute and made good, people could see that there was a problem, and very quickly the rest of the team were landing around me, were providing the protection needed, and trying to cater for the fact that there was a severe injury on the ground, calling in for ground crew and med support. And one of the last memories I have, and I'll share that with you in a second, but one of the last memories I have as the ground crew medical team arrived, because I was a senior medic at that time, as the ground crew medic team arrived, and I saw the little red cross and knew that I was at least now safe or safer, I recognised the two medics jumping out of the ambulance, running towards me as people that I'd previously trained. Maybe a year or so earlier, had been in my classroom that I'd taught to become the qualification that they now hold to be in theatre. And as they're running towards me, knowing that there's an injury, and then going, "No way, it's Jay, it's Jay, it's Jay," and recognising who I was rather than just another casualty. And there's this weird sense of adrenaline and morphine and relief and pain that are all fighting for supremacy in your mind. And the last thing I can remember before either the morphine kicked in or I simply passed out with the pain or whatever it was that led me into a state of unconsciousness. But the last memory I have of the battlefield was looking up at these two medics and thinking, were you top of the class? Or did you just scrape through? And it's just this surreal memory that I have, because I passed out. They determined that because of my injuries, I was probably best to be kept unconscious. So they put me into a induced coma to maintain me in that state. And the next time I woke up, I was 71 hours later. I was already out of theatre. I'd been operated on. I was in a hospital back in Germany.
Oh, wow. Okay. So it sounds like a lot had happened in
yeah,
those
I'd had
3 days.
9 hours of surgery and about 15 hours of flight. And by the time I got home, I was in an intensive care unit in a military hospital in Germany. It was quite surreal, because you don't know that you've been asleep for that long, but when you wake up and the whole environment's changed and you've been shaved whilst you've been unconscious, and all of the things that you take for granted and aren't are already done. So that was the first thing, and learning what had happened to me and asking some questions about the condition I was in. And the next 24, 48 hours were quite surreal, really, with regards to, as a medic, understanding a lot more about the medical implications of what had happened to you, as opposed to just another soldier that's been told, "Oh, you broke your leg and we fixed it." Knowing that I've got pins and I've got plates, and that's probably going to determine that I'm going to need to learn to walk again, because if I've damaged the lower part of my back, my sciatica, and so knowing a lot of what was going to happen probably helped me a lot to prepare myself for being told what was going to happen, as opposed to it being a complete shock. And my only aspiration at the time was, I don't care what on earth that they say, I'm going to prove that I'm physically capable of maintaining my job. I can't afford to be medically discharged from the army. I've got to be able to maintain a certain level of physicality that says, even if he's not an operationally fit soldier, he's allowed to stay in and remain in the training wing and teach others and be of service. So that was my primary aim as we went into recovery phase and into physiotherapy, and to learn how to walk and all the other stuff that you have to do after such injuries. My sole purpose was, what is the minimum standard required for me to maintain my job? And for the first 5 weeks, things went particularly well. It was very painful. It was very difficult. I didn't necessarily always respond well to the treatment regime that they had available to me. I think the physiotherapy team were just absolute gods and goddesses with regards to the level of discipline and empathy that they show in being able to help somebody in that situation, to be able to understand what's possible and what's not, and to push beliefs and pain barriers was just phenomenal. The subsequent thing that happened, and probably the biggest impact, certainly for this podcast, was what happened between week 5 and week 6. And what I've noticed is I was on a little side ward with 5 other soldiers, 4 soldiers and an airman from the Air Force, and I was the only one that hadn't lost a limb. I was on a ward where the other attendees, there was a double leg amputee opposite me. There was a gentleman who'd lost an arm and a leg to the side of me. This gentleman had lost 3 limbs. The person over there had got a big plate in the back of his head and lost his shoulder.
Mm-hmm.
I was the only one that had got pins and plates, but no prosthetics. And my
Mm-hmm.
mind started to tell me, you don't fit in, and they do.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah.
And I developed sleep apnea because I had this, I started to believe and have this self-perception
Mm-hmm.
that if I fell asleep, they're going to put me back under anesthetic and they're going to cut a limb off, like my leg, because it was so damaged, so I fit in with everybody else.
Yeah.
I've been put on the wrong ward. I'm on the
Yeah.
prosthetics ward and they haven't taken it off me yet.
Oh, and that's part of the traumatized thought process too, because there's, the difference between fitting in. Fitting in comes from a lot of times from developmental trauma, because the need to fit in is an external locus of control. I don't belong with my environment, versus belonging. Belonging comes from within. Belonging is a sense of belonging to yourself, knowing who you are, knowing what exists at your core, and being okay with whatever's in your environment, because you know who you are from the inside out and you can manage whatever life throws at you.
Yeah.
Versus the external need to fit in.
It's quite ironic because,
mm-hmm.
As a soldier, you're often going into such a chaotic environment to try and create some form of peace or stability.
Mm-hmm.
That you might argue that shouldn't be such an issue. And yet, in actual fact, the very fact that, one, you have a service number that stays with you for your life. I've been out the service now for longer than I was in it, and I still recall it like it was my middle name. You wear a uniform the same as everybody else, and you go as a team that collectively you can go into whatever environment that, in however chaotic it is, but you've created some form of normality in which you're going into it, and therefore created some form of stability for your own responsibility or your own role within it. And yet here I was, and I'd gone from being in a battlefield to being unconscious, to being maintained unconscious whilst being moved from one country to another and one environment to another. And by the time I woke up, my wife, sadly, we're no longer together, but my wife, the mother of my son, had already made some medical decisions about my treatment that by the time I woke, I'd been treated. And all of this had happened without I'd gone back to being a 5 or 6 year old child, and all the decisions being made for me.
So it's funny how life repeats those cycles for us.
If we haven't learned to overcome or adapt or address it first time round, then it will come back and bite you on the ass the second time round and the third if necessary.
Absolutely. And did she make decisions that aligned with what you would have made for yourself? Had you been
don't get me wrong,
wonderful?
I've got nothing but admiration and gratitude for the decisions that she made, because I know some of them were against her own beliefs, but it was what I would have wanted, and I'm eternally grateful for that. But at the time of being in trauma and being in distress, you don't think logically. You simply recognize that all of these have been made without your consent or without your knowledge or prior agreement.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it does make a difference too, to be able to recognize that the decisions were made, like you just said, she went against her own beliefs to make decisions that she felt you would have made for yourself. And that's a difference too, because even though you have this cycle repeating itself in your life, this was a little bit of a shift, because it wasn't all about her and what she wanted and what she wanted you to do. She was thinking about you. So that helps. It's kind of in that weird in-between area where it's like, from the traumatized brain, it's like, okay, here we go again. I'm not making my own decisions in life. And it's a different scenario because, your consideration or your needs were taken into consideration before the decision was made.
Yes.
So, and so I'm curious to find out if, this cycle repeated itself and shifted again later in your life at some point.
Yes, most recently.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, wonderful.
so I started to have these sleep apnea moments where I couldn't allow myself to sleep. The longer I was awake, the more irrational I became. The more irrational I became, the more that they felt the need to try and sedate me because I was being irrational. The more they tried to sedate me, the more I believed the desire to be able to knock me out and take my leg. And it was an ever-decreasing circle, which eventually determined that I had a breakdown. I was sectioned under the Mental Health Act and detained for my own safety. And moved from that ward into another ward, so they could keep an eye on me. And ironically, whilst I was incredibly distressed at the time that it happened, I was actually almost relieved by the fact that at least I was now in a ward where people didn't have prosthetics, and I'd moved from one horrible situation to another horrible situation, but at least one I could rationalize a little bit more in my mind, even though that probably on the scale of things, I was moving in a backwards direction as opposed to moving forward and progressing. And interestingly enough, I mean, I use this term very glibly, and I sincerely hope that I don't offend anyone by doing so. But in 2002, late 2000, beginning of 2001, when I was first diagnosed with combat PTSD, I refer to it as I was diagnosed it before it became popular, or before it became fashionable. It wasn't on everyone's agenda in 2001 as it is now. And whilst it was recognised and acknowledged and diagnosed, it also meant that a lot of the psychiatric nursing team that I was now being looked after by, I was a new case. I was a new field opportunity. I was a case study. And probably for the first 6 or 7 weeks, in reflection, and I acknowledge that there's a need for learning and training, but I was a bit of much of a pincushion or a gerbil being tested both a multitude of different theories about how to treat it.
Oh, okay.
I'm an F grade nurse and I'm doing this part of my dissertation and I need to be able to learn all about X. Here's a great case study. He's locked up, therefore I've got access to him whenever I need to, and I can ask him a whole series of questions or test this and find out that and learn this and the other. Thanks very much, I've got my grade, I'll move on. Next one comes in, I'm doing this bit. And for 6 weeks I was pretty much, I certainly felt a little bit like a pincushion or being prodded in a zoo as an animal. With regards to, let's find out what works and what doesn't. And invariably, if you go through a whole series of different treatment protocols and regimes, one after another very quickly, none of them work, even if any of them could have worked if you just seen it through for long enough.
Exactly. And it can really be confusing to the system to mix too many all at once as well. Yeah.
So certainly about 2.5, 3 months into my stay in hospital, I was at the level where I was suicidal. They'd taken my razor blade and my shoelaces away, and I wasn't allowed to be in a room without being observed either by somebody else or a camera or something like that. And you're just broken, you know, when you wake up and you cry because you're awake, and you don't want to eat because there's nothing to eat for. You just become nothing. And yet, in actual fact, it's from there that I took my greatest learnings. Because once you've accepted that you're nothing, once you've got to a level where you've stopped crying because there's no point in doing it anymore, you've perhaps just run out of tears for the day. But once you've got to a state of nothingness, then you can actually say, well, if I'm not dead, and if I'm not going to die, then what do I want to do in living? And you get a choice. And I was really, really fortunate to have an exceptional psychotherapist who worked with me for the next 5 months and helped me rebuild who I now am. And, you know, without being evangelical about things, I can honestly say in those 5 months that I was pretty much reborn. I've become the person I've always wanted to be and never knew how to become. And it was only through going through such a state of nothingness that I've subsequently learned how to be able to make choices about who I want to be and how I want to be and who I want to be with and how I want to be with them. I've been able to rebuild everything, not off the basis of my parents or my upbringing, but through a conscious choice as an adult.
Yeah, and that's beautiful. I love how you describe that, because nothing, if you can get yourself to a place of nothing, then you have no attachment to anything anymore. So there's no longer attachment to what your parents told you when you were a kid, no longer attachment to what anybody told you, no longer any attachment to what the world expects you to be or you to become.
Yep.
And so if we can let go of those attachments, because the hardest place to change, where we're coming from, any person, if you really truly want to change something in your life, or you want to transform your life, and you're attached to being somebody, you're attached to being this particular version of yourself, it's going to be painful, and it's going to be a huge struggle to transform your life into what you envision, especially if you're kind of hovering around that rock bottom place. So being able, and I love that you pointed this out, like being able to get into that space of nothing. If you have nothing, if you're no attachment, and your mind is able to let go of everything that you thought you were, then you have a blank slate and a blank canvas to recreate yourself. And one of my favorite teachers that I listen to a lot is a man by the name of Joe Dispenza. Are you familiar with Joe Dispenza?
I indeed, yes.
Yeah, and Joe Dispenza talks about this all the time. His meditations are geared to get people into no space, no time, nobody. So you can recreate for yourself without having to hit the ground at 35 miles per hour to do it.
Amen.
Because, oh my gosh, you poor thing, like it just, it was a long haul. And, some people really do need, I don't know that I would say that you needed this. It's how it happened in your life. But for some people, how this transformation happens is hitting the tree at 70 miles per hour or hitting the ground at 35 miles per hour, whatever it is. A lot of people
say, if I had to go through everything that I've been through in order to become the person I am today, then regardless of how painful and difficult and the many errors and failures that I've made along the way, being the person I am today was well worth it.
Yeah. And that's a sign of true healing, when somebody says it was all worth it, or I see the purpose in my suffering, or if when people get to the point and say, yeah, it really sucked, but to get here, that's what was required, and I would do it again if I had to.
Absolutely. Without a second thought.
And that is a true sign of somebody who's healed from their trauma, and they're not just avoiding or spiritually hijacking or bypassing the work that it takes to heal. Because the belief that people will struggle with PTSD symptoms for the rest of their life, that is a myth coming from people who don't know, who haven't experienced PTSD, and who haven't come through it.
The only caveat I'll put to that, and I'm really keen to share this also, is the only way I don't continue to suffer PTSD is because I remain conscious about the journey I've been through.
Yes.
If we look at Kolb's 4 levels of consciousness, and we go from unconscious incompetence to conscious incompetence, and then conscious competence to unconscious competence, there is always the risk that when we get to that unconscious level of competence, that we actually slide into this level of complacency, which in actual fact becomes unconscious incompetence. And for people with PTSD, for people with complex trauma PTSD, certainly for people with combat PTSD, you can carry it for the rest of your life. It can become a crutch to which you hold and utilize as a shield sometimes to protect us from what life has to throw at us because of all the things that we've already had thrown at us. But in actual fact, through conscious choice, through remaining in that conscious competence, as opposed to allowing myself to move into unconscious competence, allows me to be able to manage the condition that I had and have, in such a way that it doesn't have any form of impact on my day-to-day life.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I don't disagree with that at all, because it does. It takes work. And by work, what I mean is personal responsibility, personal accountability, not blaming the rest of the world for everything that happened to me. Things like that. And that level, once you step into the responsibility and the accountability, then you're into that level of conscious competence that you're talking about.
It's interesting because a few years ago, I'll say a few years ago, it's 10 years ago now, but 2009 was the last time I had quite significant flashbacks from my time in the trauma centre, from the second Gulf, from my time in hospital, from my time under section. It went on for about 6 or 7 weeks. It got quite bad. I was at risk of, if I hadn't had the support team around me within my family and friends that I had at the time, I may have ended up back in hospital for a while to try and protect myself. I went through quite a blip. And yet I can reflect on that now and recognize that in the 6, 7, 8 months leading up to that point, I'd become so complacent about where I was. I hadn't carried out what I would consider my daily drills, which is what you would have done, with fatigues in the army and all that type of stuff. I'd negated all of the things that I'd learned to do to protect myself and thought that I was surpassed it and I put it behind me. And it came back and bit me on the ass, as if, just to remind me that in actual fact, the reason that you do these things is to prevent you from doing these things.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. And when I work with clients, that is a big part of the work we do, is helping people figure out what is that daily routine that keeps you connected to yourself, and committing to some sort of daily routine or regular practice that keeps you connected to yourself, whatever that looks like, because that's different for everybody. Some people like to go out and run, 5, 6, 8, 10 miles a day. I've done that. I did a half marathon once, and I'm like, no, I don't ever see a need to run this far ever again. And it was only a half. It's not my thing. There are other ways that I find to get outside or, to do my daily practice. So whatever that is to find out, kind of flesh out what you love to do and flesh out what really connects you with yourself, because my practice is not going to work for everybody else. And and you were right, because the next thing I was about to say was, for true healing really to occur, it does take that conscious awareness of where you are and what's happening in your life, and noticing when you start to have those subtle signs and symptoms come up, so you can nip it in the bud, rather than, looking back, because we all have hindsight and we all look back to, yeah, gosh, before my really big breakdown, or before this really big incident happened, or before, I really flipped out that one time, there were all these little subtle symptoms that I just kind of brushed under the rug and I ignored, or I logically reasoned them away as something else. You know what they are now. So pay attention to those things. And when they start to rear their ugly heads, now you know how to manage them. And so again,
have you read the book 7 Second Philosophy by Derek Mills?
I have not. 7 Second Philosophy. I'm going to write that down.
It's phenomenal. And I suppose Derek is a UK guy who's just had a cameo role in The Secret, the film.
Okay.
But his book 7 Second Philosophy is all about being able to go back to the body's natural chakras. He's not a spiritual guy by any sense of the imagination. He used to be a stock trader on the London Stock Exchange. He was a bull out there trying to make £1 million, £1 million an hour type stuff. And he had a breakdown. And through his learning and what he shares in his book is, unless you are an A&E surgeon, a life-saving surgeon in a hospital accident and emergency ward, nothing is going to die if you don't simply take 7 seconds and take a decent breath in and a decent breath out and let it sit with you for one breath and determine, 1, what do you think about this? 2, how do you feel about this? And then push it further down into the gut and say, and how does it feel about you?
Oh, and that's
Just,
brilliant.
and
Yeah.
just this 7 seconds of taking a breath and
Mm-hmm.
stopping for a minute, as opposed to being caught up in the race of expectation of doing something instantaneously or something the way that we've always done. And in
Right.
actual fact, if we've always done what we've always done, we'll always have what we have already. If you want a
Exactly.
different outcome, you have to start thinking different thoughts and doing different actions to result in different outcomes.
Yes.
Just taking the times to say, is this the right way to do it for me? Or is that just simply the way I've always done it?
Right. Exactly. And, and real transformation doesn't happen on your yoga mat or, in the middle of, a run when you're in the zone or whatever your daily practice is. That's not where transformation takes place. Transformation takes place in the moment whenever you feel the anxiety coming up or you feel this emotion rising up in you. And in that moment between the emotion and the response, that's where transformation takes place. And I love this second philosophy. It really isn't all that different than, a practice that I teach some of my clients. And that is to take a breath, not necessarily 7 seconds, but take a breath and put space. Let that breath be the space between the trigger and the response.
Amen.
Because the more space that you can put in between that thing that gets you activated and triggered or offended and riled up, the more space you can put between that moment and the moment that you actually respond can be the difference between a reaction that you'll later regret and a response that you'll be proud of. Like, oh my gosh, I did that. I adulted today. Good for me.
Now, don't get me wrong. If you're jumping with a parachute, you've only got 1,800 feet. 7 seconds is about 97 feet. So there isn't the times to think about it all the time. But in moments where, like you say, you feel that reaction and that response, just simply becoming more consciously aware of it as opposed to going into autopilot, it's often enough to be able to question, why am I going to respond this way? And what would happen if I responded a different way to the way that I would normally have done so?
Exactly. And the situations where you don't have 7 seconds are so few and far between and rare that we ever find ourselves in that situation that it's not even a viable excuse to say, I can't do this. Even if you're the surgeon in the emergency room, it's not, you're going to be in that situation more often than the average person. And still, it's going to be a vast minority of the time that you're going to lose somebody in 7 seconds if you don't take a breath.
Amen.
So yeah, it's so important. And so you've really come through this. And so now tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing now and how you're helping people.
It's twofold, really. I fell into speaking quite by accident. The final stages of my recovery when I left the military were picked up very kindly by a national charity that looks after veterans with mental health illnesses or mental health trauma. And I lived in one of their halfway houses for about 7 months when I first left.
Okay.
Learning to become who I am, learning my civilian identity, my place in the world and in the community post-service. And I went on, I got a decent job. I did okay for myself. I was working at a corporate level, at a boardroom level in a corporate environment. Everything was going particularly well. I'd met somebody else. We were settling down. Things were going and everything was good. And all of a sudden, the charity that had funded my recovery was doing a roadshow. 1, to try and raise awareness, and 2, to try and raise some funds for the charity. And this was probably 6 or 7 years after I'd left. And I suddenly stopped and felt such a schmuck. I suddenly realized I'd been getting on with life and things had been going so much better since I'd left that I'd never stopped to consider and remember the charity that had enabled me to become who I am. I'd forgotten to go back and put a few dollars in the can, as it were, and say thanks very much. So I went online. I went on the internet and found their website, and the usual thing where it says for $30 it pays for an hour of this, and for $130 it pays for 6 hours of that, and for $290 it pays for 24 hours of this. And I sat there with a calculator and suddenly had this shock that for the time that I'd been there, according to their website, they'd spent the best part of about $87,000 on my recovery that I hadn't even considered.
Mm-hmm.
I knew I'd done well, and I knew that they'd looked after me, and I'd got on and I'd moved on, and I hadn't stopped and reflected on the financial costs that I'd gone through enabling me to get there. And whilst I didn't have $90,000 stashed in a drawer somewhere to be able to simply give a donation, I figured I was going to go to this event, and I was going to make several. I mean, okay, we're in pounds over here. I'm converting it to dollars for an American audience, but I was going to make a small but sizable, noticeable donation to the charity. Hopefully, I would get a little bit of local press because I was going to make a £10,000 donation that night. It might make me feel a little bit better than the guilt I suddenly felt. And then I subsequently found that maybe not one of the guys that had treated me on that day, but somebody else that I'd worked with in the army was now working for the charity and would be there that evening. And I thought, well, this will be even better. I'll have a catch up. I'll be able to pay a check. Everyone will feel good. Might encourage some other people to make a sizable donation also. Everything's great. And I got there. I invited some friends and some family, some colleagues, some clients that I've been working with. Some of the people I'd invited there, to 27 people that came on my invitation, and some of the people that came didn't even know I'd been a soldier. Had only known me since my civilian career. And I didn't necessarily talk about my past. And when we got there, we found that the event organizer was in complete disarray. He was really panicking. There was supposed to be about 250 people coming that evening, and he was pulling his hair out. And I said, well, Richard, I know you as a man of cool and calm. You do events for a living. You do big events for a living. What's the problem? He says, well, the gentleman that's coming up from the charity has been involved in a car accident. Now, thankfully, he's not that injured, but he's in no fit state to be delivering anything this evening. And I've got all these people coming, and my wife's on the internet at the moment trying to download a few things to tell people so we don't have to cancel. And these words blurted out my mouth without even thinking about them, and said, well, I was a soldier, and the charity funded my recovery, and I know Kelvin really, really well. If there's something I can do to help, let me know. And I meant, if you want me to sit with your wife and say a few stories for her to read out, then so be it. And he said, Jay, that's wonderful. He says, which table are you sat on? I said, oh, table 27 over there. No. You come and sit on table 4 right here at the front. Oh, thanks very much. So we all get moved to the front into the VIP area, and we're all sat there and having a bit of a meal, and the first course and the second course are being served. And then he stands up and says, ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, the gentleman that we did have here has been involved in a bit of an accident and he's no longer able to be with us today. But his boss is, ladies and gentlemen, Jay Allen.
Surprise!
I was hoping that there was somebody else with my own name. And I suddenly realised that he'd got a different idea about how I could help than the one that I intended.
Right.
And I stood up and I went to the front, and I was a little bit panicky and the likes. And I told the story. This was at a time where the Chilcot inquiry in the UK was going on with regards to the legalities to go to war in the Second Gulf was at its prime, and it was all in court at the time, and people were being called back to parliaments to discuss the legalities of whether we should have gone in the first place. So it was a very poignant subject at the time. And I just simply said, look, we were all doing our job, and whether the politics are right or wrong, you can't allow your opinion of whether we should have been there or not to taint the fact that 27 people didn't come back on my tour. I'm here as a result of being there and doing this. And I just told an emotional story. And 3 things happened. First of all, we raised about £97,000 that evening, which was about 5 times more than the event organizer had even anticipated.
Nice.
Secondly, a guy came up to me and said, I'm a speaker booker, and we've been sent to look at this chap from the agency because we're looking for a veteran to be on our books and tell a military story. If you're not already exclusive with the agency that sent you, can we book you? And I'm thinking, speaker booker, agency? What on earth are you talking about? I'm here with my friends and family.
Right.
I've paid for a damn ticket. I'm not an agent. So what are you talking about? I've never heard of a speaker booker before. And I said, yes, of course you can. Give me a card and I'll get in touch. And then the event organizer came up to me in the end and he says, Jay, I don't know what you do for a living, but whatever it is, you're wasted if you don't speak on stage and share your story and generate more money for the charity. Because we were expecting to try and raise about 23,000 this evening, and we've raised nearly 90. And I think that's down to the honesty, the vulnerability in which you've shared your story. I think you should do it again. So I gave the weekends to give it some consideration. I phoned this agent on the Monday and we ended up having a conversation back in 2011. And I handed my notice in at work on the 1st of January 2012.
Nice.
And I've been speaking around the world, telling people a story about mental blocks and mental agility ever since, really.
Okay, wonderful. And I know that you've also written a couple books.
I have indeed, yeah.
Yeah, and those are on Amazon. I'll put the links up in the show notes for our listeners. The first one is Battlefield to Boardroom. And that's available on Amazon, and also Road to Utopia, the Road to Utopia. And 2 is the number 2 instead of TO.
Battlefield to Boardroom is all about helping people to understand how to work better as a team and how collectively we can always achieve more than we will individually. But don't always assume that a team has to be your colleagues at work. It could be family members, it could be collectives of people on the street, it could be a local community, it could be a local group that comes together. But understanding the roles of team and how collectively team allows us to achieve any more than we could individually, to be able to get a different set of results. And then Road to Utopia is all about people that set life goals and never achieve them. I get quite frustrated by people that tell me that they've got a bucket list. These are all the things I'm going to do in my life. And my only attitudes towards that is, why on earth would you tick anything off a list that says when it's done, you're going to kick the bucket?
Right.
There's no enthusiasm or impetus to tick anything off the list if you've called it a kick the bucket list.
Right.
So instead, your Road to Utopia is all about having a living list of things that I'm going to do whilst I'm alive. And allowing us to understand that if we set a list of things and intents and goals and deadlines of things that we're going to do in 2020, right here, right now, this year, then in actual fact, those experiences that we have by engaging in those activities will allow us to add even more elaborate things to 2021's list and 2022's list. So set aside a set of things that you are going to do this year, and then from that, every experience teaches us other things that we might want to do as a result.
Absolutely. Oh, I love that. And and what is your preferred way? Because we're kind of running out of time here. So if any listeners want to reach out to you, what's the easiest way, or where you're most accessible, for somebody who might want to reach out or contact you?
I use LinkedIn every single day. I'm on it for at least an hour a day, every day, communicating, either sharing stories or contributing to things. I'm a LinkedIn Live user, so I do LinkedIn video as well. So LinkedIn is my preferred method, but I am also all over Facebook with both a group and a page that I have a small team, but they do other things in my business. I do tend to concentrate all of my efforts on social media myself.
Okay. Yeah. And I remember you have a website also?
Sure. JayAllen.UK.
Okay, awesome. And I'll make sure I put a link up for that too.
That's fine. Thank you.
So thank you so much. And before we sign off, just a couple more quick questions before we sign off. So what would you say to others who might have combat PTSD?
First of all, acknowledge the fact that you're not alone. There is a significant fear of admission of combat PTSD. You know, for all of our training teaches us to be invincible, teaches us to be killers, teaches us to be the warrior that goes out there as an invincible. And all of a sudden we have this. Sometimes PTSD would be easier if I broke my leg or broke my arm, because it's a physical injury and people can see it and empathize and understand. And the fear of being able to admit that there's something that's happened internally that we can't see and therefore rationalize prevents so many people from coming forward and simply saying, look, I'm not okay at the moment. And you know, there's a huge big campaign on Twitter at the moment with regard to the hashtag, it's okay to say I'm not okay. I'm an ambassador for that hashtag and for that movement.
Okay.
For people, first of all, is to acknowledge that if there's a problem, if somebody else is telling you that there's a problem, if you haven't even acknowledged it yourself that there's a problem, if somebody is suggesting to you that either you've got a mood swing or there's a difference in attitude or behavior or perception about something, then it's time to be able to simply go to somebody else and say, I'd really like to talk about something at the moment. And to create an environment is such that you have the safety to be able to do so.
Yeah.
So please, first of all, as a rule, don't suffer in silence, because there are so many of us out there that have been through traumas either like yourself or even worse or not as bad as the things that you've witnessed and seen. And it's not about comparisons. It's about simply saying you're not alone, and you must feel comfortable in order to be able to tell somebody, a friend, a stranger, a policeman, a doctor, your next door neighbor, I don't care who it is, but reach out and tell somebody it's okay to say I'm not okay.
Yes, beautiful. And before we finally sign off, Jay, do you have any final tips or bits of wisdom to leave with our listeners?
I think perhaps it's Einstein. I love reading Einstein's work. I think the man was an absolute genius in almost everything that he did. And Einstein simply said, if you were only given 24 hours to save the world, then I'd spend 23 hours thinking about how to save the world. You will always achieve more in life, both personally, professionally, socially, emotionally, spiritually, if you give it thought first, as opposed to simply dive in. So just take those 7 seconds that we spoke about throughout this podcast and give it consideration. What outcome do I want to achieve? And is the action or reaction I'm about to have likely to create that action, that reaction?
Beautiful. Well, Jay, thank you so much. It's been an honor and a pleasure to have you on the show today. You've shared some wonderful information, some really valuable tips and techniques for our listeners. I'll make sure that I throw up in the show notes links to find you on Facebook, LinkedIn, your website, and also to your books on Amazon.
God bless you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And for all of our listeners, this is Jennifer Whitacre, the host of Yes And. You can find me online at jenniferwhitacre.com. At my website, you can find the podcast page. Please share this episode, especially if you know any veterans, because veterans, I really, truly believe, struggle with a lot of these issues. And veterans, men, it's harder for men and veterans because both have a stigma to them to speak up and say that we're struggling inside of ourselves. You know, you have a man who's a warrior and you're supposed to be invincible, like Jay said. And that's not the case. So find that safe space, reach out to somebody. And Jay has graciously offered to give 30 minutes, a 30-minute call, free call to discuss how to take steps to manage your PTSD. So if you go to his website, again, you'll be able to find his email and reach out and say, I heard you on Yes and just ask him, to schedule that 30-minute free call to get some tips and a little strategy on how to manage your PTSD. So this is Jennifer Whitacre signing off, and I will see you all next time on Yes and.
We have just concluded another episode of the Yes and podcast with Jennifer Whitacre. For additional resources, please visit our website, jenniferwhitacre.com. Leave a review if you enjoyed the show and find it useful. Until next time, continue challenging conventional thinking and keep moving forward.